Hello everyone, and welcome to my next video. Tonight I'm going to talk about some general myths regarding domestic violence. I'm going to say the words myth and domestic violence a lot in the next few minutes. I'm going to regurgitate some of the myths that I've already talked about, so you may hear some familiar bits. So first myth, domestic violence is rare. Actually, 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence in their lifetime. It's a huge problem. So if you're not paying attention, now is a good time to start because it can easily happen to you. Next, people like to believe that men are not victims of domestic violence. Men actually comprise anywhere from 15 to 50% of the victims of domestic violence. Like I said, women can be just as manipulative as men. I believe that men are less likely to come forward and be counted because they either don't know that they've been victimized or because they're too embarrassed to admit to being a victim. I think this partly explains the gender gap between victims. Another myth is that domestic violence only happens in certain races. There isn't really a typical victim or batterer. Abusive relationships occur in every region, societal class, ethnicity, education level, sexuality, socioeconomic status, you name it. That being said, there are certain risk factors such as poverty or unemployment that can make it more probable for an individual to become involved in domestic violence, but correlation does not equal causation. The idea that drugs and alcohol cause domestic violence is another myth. Alcohol and drugs do not put violent impulses in people's heads, but they can lower inhibitions or impulse control, which makes it easier for the aggressor to turn to violence. Those violent impulses have to already be present so that when the alcohol and drugs loosen the person up, they act on those impulses. Substance abuse may work to increase the violence, but it doesn't cause it. The fact is that for any one abuser who batters when they're drunk or high, there are many more who batter completely sober. Another myth is that mental illness causes domestic violence. The vast majority of people with mental illnesses don't batter other people. Mental illness is more likely to be the result of domestic violence rather than the cause of it. The belief that victims deserve the abuse is yet another myth. Obviously, no one deserves to be beaten or abused in any way. This particular myth only encourages blame shifting in our society, and it obscures the truth that the abusers alone are responsible for their behavior. Most people think that if it were that bad, they would just leave the relationship. There are so many obstacles to leaving abusive relationships, including but not limited to financial, geographical, psychological, and medical complications. Most abusive partners threaten retaliation if the victim tries to leave the relationship. You really have no idea what they're going through unless you've been there for yourself. Some people believe that batterers don't love their victims. Batterers usually do love their partners, but they take it to an unhealthy level where jealousy and possessiveness become a problem. Once an abuser, always an abuser is another myth. If the batterer is willing to accept responsibility for their actions and seek therapy, there's a chance for recovery. There's another myth that they didn't mean it or that the abuse was unintentional. To say that domestic violence is unintentional falsely implies that it was caused by a lack of forethought or control. This in itself is a huge myth about domestic violence. Abusers are more than capable of restraining themselves when it suits them most to do so. They know not to hit you where other people will see it, and they know to do it when no one else is around. It's not an anger management issue, and it's not caused by a lack of restraint. Domestic violence is not caused by the batterer's lack of control, but by a desire to gain control. They know to control their violent impulses in front of their boss or in front of the family. So you have to ask yourselves, why don't they control themselves around you? Domestic violence is very much intentional. Most victims like to believe that the abuse was an isolated event, that it won't happen again. This is also a myth. Just like I said, unless the abuser has shown they're willing to accept the responsibility and they actually go through with the therapy, then you can expect the battering behavior to continue. It might take a few days or a few years, but if you wait around long enough, it will happen again. Domestic violence is a cycle. It occurs in a pattern that can be predicted. Another myth is that domestic violence only happens to people who grew up in violent households. This particular belief is applicable to both the victims and the batterers. People think that children who witness domestic violence are going to be perpetual victims of it later in life, and that children who fall victim to domestic violence are going to become abusers themselves when they grow up. This isn't true. There are plenty of survivors out there who have gone on to have normal, healthy relationships, and many adults who have grown up in abusive situations are more than capable of learning nonviolent problem-solving methods. Another myth is that domestic violence is a family problem. Actually, domestic violence is a community problem. It has far-reaching implications that affect not only the family, but the hospitals and the psychiatrists who are called in to help them. Victims need all kinds of medical, psychological, social, and economic support, which can put a strain on the public systems in place. A huge myth is that you can only call it domestic violence when it becomes physical. Domestic violence takes many forms, including emotional, economic, and spiritual abuse. Another myth is that violence is caused by stress, or anger, or frustration. The batterer may use such phrases as, "You don't want to get me mad." Actually, domestic violence isn't caused by feelings. It's caused by our attitudes towards the opposite sex and the habits we have developed on how to problem solve. If you believe that women are inferior to men and you have a habit of punching things when you're angry, you're significantly more likely to batter. So that's all I've got for tonight. There are other myths out there. I just covered some basic ones. If you'd like more information, you can check out the links I've posted below. So thank you for watching and have a good night.